welcome to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. My name is Teresa MacLennan. I'm Executive Director here at the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. We are so glad that you have joined us today. Before we begin and we talk to our wonderful guest, we do want to thank and acknowledge our Indigenous community for history, culture, and really allowing us to share in this space. We thank you so much. So today we are talking to my good friend, Shana Lickers. And Shana has worked here at the Women and Children's Shelter for a long, long time. And she is a wealth of knowledge and experience. But today we're going to talk about Shana the woman, and we're going to talk about her background, and we are going to learn about the Mowhawk Nation. So Shana, welcome. I'm so glad you're here today.
Hi, good afternoon, Teresa. Thank you. I'm glad to be here too. So, my name is Shana Lickers. I am an Indigenous woman, Mowhawk Nation. My family comes from the south towards Six Nations, and I'm Wolf Clan.
So we're going to dive into that because you know what? We all need to learn, become allies, be educated, respectful of all of our Indigenous peoples. And so I want to learn today, Shana. I am an open book and I just really want to learn from you. So June is National Indigenous History Month. Let's start there. Why do you think, in your opinion, why is it important that we recognize that?
Well, I think it's important because Indigenous peoples has played a significant role in the history of how Canada started. We were here and we had our traditions and our culture and our life here even before Canada was Canada. So I think it's important to recognize that the roots of Canada was founded on Natives, Indigenous people being here.
Yeah, and so I think we're going to talk a lot more about that. And I think I'd like to learn more about what it means to be a Mohawk woman, part of Mowhawk Nation. And I do hope that we have some time today to talk about the experience and history of Indigenous people, because I think that that's highly important as well. Can you talk to us about the difference in some of those Indigenous communities, Mohawk?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to take a deep breath because that's a pretty big topic.
I know.
So one thing I can say is that all Native nations are not the same. I know sometimes people who don't understand seem to lump it all into one, but it's not the case. It's all different nations from all different parts of Canada. We definitely have our own culture, our own language, our own clothing, our own teaching stories, our own clans separate from one another. For example, I could tell you about the Mohawks. I know that living here in Barrie, a lot of times people just assume I'm Ojibwe and that I do know what those Ojibwe teachings are, but I know some of them just from being around the neighborhood, but it's not my nation. So for me, I could tell you, for example, growing up, I didn't know about smudging and using sage. How I learned to pray was putting tobacco down, right? And our feasts and our ceremonies are different. Our regalia for our dance, even our dances, our music, our language, our instrument. Like we have the water drum, whereas I see a lot of the handheld drums up here. And I do appreciate those too. And but for me, it's Ojibwe, more Ojibwe base up here in Barrie. So I don't see a lot of my people's teachings up this way, but it is nice when I do come across them. We even have our own way of saying thank you. We don't say miigwech, we say Nyahweh.
Nyahweh, right? and I love that. I think this is what we hope our conversation is going to be about, so that we can learn. And you had mentioned that most people, when they might meet you, talk with you, see you, they assume that you are Ojibwe. And is that because there is a larger Ojibwe population here in Ontario or locally?
I think in this territory. So when you give the thanks to the land acknowledgement, it's to the natives who were in this territory, which is the Ojibwe peoples is, I think, more predominant.
Okay. And when I've heard you talk, I mean, we want to always be cautious of language to make sure we're using the right language. And I am always very sensitive and want to learn to make sure. When I hear you speak, you also say the word native.
Oh, yes.
Can you help me to understand that interchange of language and what is most appropriate for us to say?
Well, that definitely opens up a big topic too, Teresa, because every 10 years, the government changes the word. So for myself to keep up with whatever our peoples are being called, for me, it's just Mowhawk Nation. I known it to be Native people ask each other what their nation is, right? And that's the same. But I find every decade or so, there's a new terminology from how the government calls our people.
So is that term native
yeah,
really coming from that then?
Yeah, it's just what I got and grown to used to. It's just what I'm used to and how I mostly used to talk that way. And I have to change and update my language to coincide with the government language sometimes just to keep up with the times.
And why, that's an interesting thing, right? We might be heading in a different direction in terms of our conversation here. But what has your experience been in terms of government determining how they define Indigenous people?
I just want to say it's interesting you point that out that I use that word, Teresa, because I didn't even realize it. It's just so comfortable with trying to get across my point, right? I didn't even notice that's the word I predominantly go to, and you're right. So I'm sorry, what was your question?
I'm just wondering about your thoughts about government.
Oh, government.
Defining how Indigenous people are what they're called. So, I mean, I don't take offense to the word native because it's not mine to take offense to in how people define themselves. What do you feel about, do you feel that that's been sort of chipped away, ripped away from Indigenous people to define themselves who they are? Because when you talk about that word native, that's really been defined and given by politicians for policy or whatever. How does that feel? What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I think I've grown up with that for so long. I don't really attach my feelings to it anymore because I know my identity is being Mohawk. And I know that to me, that's my nation. I just think the government, it's just another way of stripping away the identity piece, right? And the historical, the trauma and taking everything away and trying to strip us of our culture and everything. Our land, taking our children. I think it coincides with all of those things, Teresa. It used to anger me a long time ago. I think I just gotten used to it. I kind of joke around with my kids, and my friends at home saying, I wondered this year what we're going to be called. Yeah, just kind of make light of it. But at the same time, it just lessens the identity piece. And going back to being Mohawk, for example, we are a matriarch nation. So we're run through the woman. So it's the woman and the clan mother who make all the important decisions, even political decisions, right? So, and our heritage runs through the Mohawk. And I could tell you my status card is Oneida because the government goes through, the father. And I grew up knowing from my grandmother that we're Mohawk, right? So it's just something myself and my kids, we just live with at this point. It's just a normal way of life.
Would you say that's been the experience for most Indigenous people?
Most that I speak to, yes. And I think that it's part of that identity and the identity crisis, which is some of the effects that the historical trauma and oppression and everything had on our people. So for myself, it's important to get back to that identity and to know who I am, no matter what the government says.
Yeah, I'm so appreciative of this conversation, Shana, because it just feels very real to me, very raw, that we're having a really honest dialogue about your experience, but I think that also represents so many Indigenous people. And so we are going to head into a short commercial break. We just really encourage our community, our viewers, to stay with us on this journey as we educate and we inform and we challenge our thinking. Because if we know more, we are informed more, we can become allies. And I think we have a lot to learn from Shana. And I just think it's great for us to be open to that. So when we come back from our commercial, we're going to dive into talking about the oppression and the discrimination that Shana has opened the door for us to talk about. And we're going to gain a better perspective and picture of what that has looked like for Indigenous people. Please stay with us. We are going to be right back.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Calling all journalism students, Omni Television is once again awarding scholarships to qualified students pursuing a career in third language journalism.
Canada is a multicultural country, and I know that there are a lot of people like me out there. We need a support to do our job in our native language.
Omni is home to a variety of locally produced current affairs programs and daily national newscasts, broadcast in 6 languages. To learn more about Omni scholarships, visit omnitv.ca/scholarships.
Focus better.
Partner better.
Sleep better.
Breathe better.
Love better. Work better. Friend better. Unwind better.
Everything gets better when you get active.
Welcome back to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. We are having a very raw and real conversation with my friend, Shana Lickers, and I am really glad that you've stayed with us for this conversation because it's very important. We need to know and respect, gain some understanding and learning about the Indigenous experience, and I'm committed to it, and I'm glad that you're with us as a community. So welcome back, Shana, and I want to dive right back in. We know that so many Indigenous folks, communities have a history that they have faced oppression and systemic barriers. Can you talk to us about that from your own experience and what you know in terms of that history?
Yes, I can. That's definitely another big topic that can take up many shows, but I'll try my best to put it as simple as I can. I can say in all areas. I moved up here to Barrie. I have 7 children that I raise, being a single mom. I get it from all angles. I see it in community at the hospital, with the police, the schools, CAS system, government, all of these areas. I can even tell you lots of examples. One right off the top of my head is when I got a new doctor. I was, at the doctor's office and, went there for many years, and he was doing intake because he was switching over from my old doctor and asked me if I was addicted to heroin. And I just said, no, I'm not. I think you guys would know that if I were. It's just the assumption. Right. And then the school, I could tell you the school calling me, asking me, they were having a coat drive and I had a lot of coats to donate. And they called me and said they had some coats for my family, just assuming I had no money. Things like this. delivering my last child here in Barrie and getting my tubes tied while I was in the midst of pain when that's not what I wanted. And I went home and my daughter says, Mom, if you weren't Native, they wouldn't have asked you that question and they wouldn't have done that. Things like this, police assuming addictions and labeling, filling the labels, even at the grocery store and going into anywhere with my children. People just staring at me and not wanting to touch my hands when giving me money back, change, things like this, getting the doctor's report from my son and, just asking them hard questions of why they wouldn't hear me out at the hospital for my concerns. And I'd ask, are you being racial? And then they call security and want me removed from the hospital, things like this. And I could tell you through COVID, I saw the difference of care over the phone when they couldn't see me was definitely a lot. I got heard, and just things like that is a normal way of life for me. I've just learned to know that people just, have their opinions and their views, and sometimes they're not good. And I try really hard just to educate them at this point. I used to get angry and then my kids would say, Mom, it's okay. It's okay, Mom. And they would always calm me down because they could see the anger coming on my face, and I know it's because of the way I look, and the assumptions are that I'm not educated and that I don't have money and that I'm addicted. And I've had CAS called a few times in my life. Teachers, non-Native, who thought that I was using drugs and alcohol when I had morning sickness, instead of talking to me and just asking me, and I would have cleared it up, no problem. That's how I even heard of CAS. And the list is endless, Teresa. It goes on, but it's very real today.
Yeah, because you spoke about current experiences that you're having, and we know that there is a historical experience of that. And I have to recognize my privilege always, and just be really, really mindful of that, right? Because I am part of that group that is maintaining those oppressions to continue. And I want to speak out against it. I want to fight against it. I want to educate against it, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make change happen, Shana? What do I do? Tell us, help us.
Well, in my opinion, like you said earlier, to get educated, the desire to want to be educated. I find that even with like my kids telling me how they do their land acknowledgement and how everybody complains through that and nobody even pays attention while it's over the PA system at their schools. So it's the desire to want to know that this is history. This has happened and still happens, and to understand from a cultural point of view who we are as a people, who I am, who my family is, and not judge, and the more educated we get, the more we can start building that trust and that reconciliation and the good relationship, right? I think that's where it starts.
Shana, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about still what is happening in the different Indigenous communities throughout our province. Like we talk a lot here, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in particular, right? What's happening in Indigenous communities that we need to know? Like I think about clean drinking water.
Yeah. Well, I could tell you from what I do know from my own community when I go, lots of drug usage, addictions, a lot of suicides. As far as my understanding, it is predominant across the nation. Native girls and boys getting sexually abused at younger ages, violence as a result, and the trauma just continues generation to generation, and lack of funds, lack of resources, right? Not having the programmings and the help and the money lack of money, funds for the reserves, just to start.
And I think you've said a word that has certainly triggered me that I think needs some exploring and just some definition about trauma.
I know a lot about that.
Yeah. And so, because I think that that's important, because would I be right in saying that people can, because you just explained that there might be substance use, suicide, murdered and missing Indigenous women, young girls, and boys. And you and I have an understanding of trauma, but I don't think that people do. And I think that people can hear those things and see it on the news, and there's a judgment about, let's say, suicide or drug use that might be happening in Indigenous communities, or really any community. And there's a judgment to that, with a lack of understanding about the trauma that people have experienced that has led them on this path of using substances or considering suicide. What can you say about trauma in relation to the Indigenous experience?
From my viewpoint, it's the families being torn apart, generational. Like I could tell you in my family alone, my mother's grandmother being at residential school, and just that disconnect from the family and coming back and not knowing the community or having those ties severed from her own family, and then passing that on to my grandmother, who couldn't make that bond with my mother, and come down to me, a multi-generational, and I had to relearn myself, even with my own kids, how do I heal past this? And I hear what I believe, what I was taught, it takes several generations to be able to start that healing process from all of that trauma, layers and layers and layers, generational, historical, the ancestors, what they went through, right down to what we're going through today. Right. So that's a never ending cycle.
And I'm so appreciative of everything that you just said for us to reflect on, because that is trauma. And, so many folks in our community can see just anyone who is using substances who needs that to cope with unresolved traumas that they've experienced, or traumas that are still continuing in their lives. And for us to gain a perspective and an understanding of the trauma behind people's lives, I think is critical, because the majority of us have experienced trauma. The Indigenous experience of trauma is profoundly greater, and as you described, is still happening today.
Yeah.
How can we expect, this is a question to our viewers in our community, how can we expect better things for all of us, the Indigenous community, when the oppressions, the systemic barriers, and the trauma, the layers and layers and layers of that continue to happen? So I guess I want to ask you that question, Shana. How do we become allies? You talked about educating ourselves. Can you just help us with that? What can I do?
Well, that's definitely a big question, Teresa, for sure. I don't think there's one answer. I think I know what I like is when people, what helps me is when people do want to understand, or they want to ask questions, and they just have that desire with that heart-filled compassion, instead of looking at the differences and having judgments based on whatever it is, or don't know. It's finding the truth, and seeing me as an equal. That's important to me, that trust, dignity, that respect, just as who I am, right?
And I love that you said that. I love that you put it into context, because you know what? At the beginning of our show, you talked about all the multiple hats that you wear. You're a mother, you're a wife, you work here at the shelter, you do great work. You're an advocate. I believe that you've done some acting, and maybe perhaps in the vagina monologues, right? I know you have so many hats you've worn, and you're an advocate for your community, but you're an advocate for the women here at the shelter, and you're an advocate for your children trying to make change happen, right?
Yep. And that's my way of giving back and contributing, Teresa. That's my way of saying, you know, I've been through these things. I have gone through them. I've done my own self-healing for many years of trauma, and I'm at a really good place in my life. And now if I can do it, I can give that back to any woman in trauma, Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And that's the key, I think, is just seeing each other as people, because we're all people.
So, you know, we only have about 4 minutes left, Shana, and I actually want to leave the last word to you. Talk to our viewers about what you want and need as a woman, as a Mowhawk Nation woman. What do you want from the community?
I think I would have to say I would just want to be seen as the person I am, not with any judgments, and treat it with dignity and respect and as an equal.
And I think too, what you were talking about at the beginning was that people made assumptions about you.
All the time.
Because of how you look.
Yeah.
And so I just really appreciate the learning and the discussion for myself, because I want to be aware and recognize my own assumptions that I may make about anybody, and to check that, to question in myself, why do I think that about this person, right? I have seen a sign that always sort of resonates with me that says, if I pass judgment on a person, that's because I have something that is not healed within myself.
Yeah.
And I try to hold true to that, because when I meet someone and there's something in me that is triggered by them, and I come to it a judgment or an assumption about them, it's not about that person. It's about me. And so I just think our conversation is so good, just to challenge our viewers, because it challenges me, to be aware of our biases, to be aware of our judgments, to recognize our privilege that we hold, and to be so mindful of that, and to respect other people without judgment, and an understanding about trauma and how trauma impacts our behavior and our actions. And if we gain some understanding about that, maybe we can really, really treat people the way that they deserve to be treated. Treat people the way that I want to be treated, right?
And find out the truth.
And find out the truth. Yeah. Because of your work here at the shelter, Shana, if there is a woman who is watching us today and she is living in abuse or living in fear, what advice would you give to her today?
I would tell her that she's not alone. Call as many times as you need to. Reach out. We're here.
You can call our crisis line 24 hours a day. And if you are an Indigenous woman, just know that we have a wealth of Indigenous women who work here that would also be happy to speak with you. Thank you so much to Shana. Thank you, our community, for coming along this journey with us as we educate, inform, and challenge. These are important conversations for all of us. I learn just as much as I'm hoping that our community does. And that is the beauty of our conversations, to come to a place of learning and growth, respect for each other, love and care for one another. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.